Thank you very much. Right, well, cast your mind back. BF, before Finch. So before the panel chaired by Dame Janet Finch reported on open access in June, July 2012, and before the debate about open access became all about gold versus green, about Research Council mandates, embargo periods and licensing regimes. When I came to Kent in 2006, I became involved in a journal that had been established and run from Kent Law School since 1993, which is a journal called Feminist Legal Studies. It had been established by feminist legal scholars in Kent Law School at that time due to the difficulty of getting feminist work published in mainstream law journals. So, for example, people would send off their article and would get back a nice letter from the journal editor saying, "Thank you very much, we found your article very interesting, but we already published one feminist piece in this volume, so we don't need any more." So there was a need for a venue for this kind of work, which the feminist legal scholars at Kent Law School decided to take up that opportunity. Now, to begin with, Feminist Legal Studies was published by a small press called Deborah Charles Publishing, which had been set up, in fact, by a legal academic, Bernard Jackson, who also published a couple of other sort of new critical law journals, another one notably Law and Critique, which had been set up a little bit earlier at Birkbeck. But in the world of publishing, nothing ever sits still. Bernard Jackson eventually sold Deborah Charles to Kluwer, and then Kluwer in turn merged with Springer, and suddenly we found ourselves part of the world of multinational publishing. Now, for various reasons, this was not a very happy experience. First of all, our managing editors and editorial assistants lived in an office in the Netherlands. We never had any contact with them, and they changed every 6 months. So it was always very difficult to know who you were dealing with or whether they had managed to deal with the issue that you had last raised with them before they left and were replaced by somebody else. Secondly, Springer in particular, unlike other major journal publishers, paid very stingy editorial fees and expenses, and so we were basically doing all of this academic labour for peanuts, and in particular they would never give us any information about online subscription packages, and they did not pay us any royalties for the amount of money that they gained from libraries for those online subscription packages. Now, this is not true of all of the major journal publishers. So, for example, Sage, Taylor and Francis do pay royalties and do give that kind of information, but Springer in particular just did not engage in that kind of discussion with its editors. And so what has happened as a result, because we weren't paid any royalties, now the journals who do receive royalties, often journals run by learned societies, but also journals that receive a significant amount of money, are able to use that money to have paid administrative staff, which of course we could not do. And those journals also typically engage in a range of other activities that help to develop the discipline. So in my discipline there are journals who use their money to have a seminar competition or to support postgraduate researchers and do developmental activities in various ways, which is a sort of very sort of public-spirited use of that royalty money. Again, we were unable to do that kind of thing because we weren't getting anything from Springer along those lines. We did, in fact, at one stage try to persuade Sage to buy us from Springer, and they did offer, but Springer refused to sell. So there we were, stuck. And then things got worse in a variety of ways. So first of all, Springer introduced a standardised style guide. Now, in fact, those of you in the sciences might know that Springer has a very high profile as a scientific journal publisher, and so its standardised style guide was absolutely appropriate for science journals. but not at all appropriate for humanities journals, and so we had to then sort of backtrack and negotiate a separate style guide for our journal, which modified the standard that they had tried to impose. Then they outsourced their production process to India, and the Indian operatives paid no attention to the specific journal style, and sometimes they corrected expressions into Indian English. So the proofs were always a complete nightmare, and we had to spend hours every time correcting errors that had been introduced by the production team to things that had been perfectly okay when we had emailed it off to them. And then the other thing, the sort of main thing, was that the editorial board of Feminist Legal Studies wanted to be engaging in global feminist legal conversations. And we set up an international advisory board to help us to do that and to extend our reach. But we realised that most of the members of the International Advisory Board and scholars more generally outside the UK had no access to our journal, had no access to feminist legal studies, because their institutional libraries didn't subscribe to it, either because Springer didn't try to sell to them or because the subscriptions were just way too high for most people outside the developed first world to afford. So we started to face the fact that the only way that we could escape from these various problems was to set up our own journal, to set up a new journal. So Springer owned the name, Feminist Legal Studies. We couldn't simply take that and start a new journal. We would have to start all over again, which of course seemed like quite a major undertaking and a very daunting prospect. But then, in fact, it was a visitor to the law school introduced us to the idea of online open access journals. And this seemed very appealing because obviously open access would solve our problems of being accessible to feminist legal scholars around the world. And an online journal would be a lot less expensive to produce than a print journal, and would also enable us to have control over the production process ourselves. So once we'd proofread something, what went up was exactly what we had intended to go up. Now, the idea, having been floated and having seemed attractive to some of us, of course, was not without controversy. Those of you who are academics, certainly academics in humanities and social sciences, will be aware that there is a kind of prevailing prejudice against online journals in general, which was certainly shared by some of our colleagues on the FLS editorial board. And the concern is that online journals publish lower quality work and more or less amount to vanity publishing. And of course that's a myth, because the quality of any journal, whether it's print or online, depends on the rigour of its refereeing processes, so it's of its peer review processes. But it's difficult for a new journal to establish that sort of reputation for publishing high quality research and engaging in rigorous review processes, as opposed to one that's been around for a while and had time to establish itself. And of course the other issue for a new journal is that of journal rankings or impact factors, which in fact we were very lucky because in the law discipline that is simply not an issue in the UK. There are issues in other countries, but in the UK we haven't engaged in, there's no journal ranking scheme, we don't refer to impact factors, but of course it's an issue I recognise in other disciplines. But what we can say in response to that is that being online and open access makes work much more accessible, and hence it's much more likely to be found and cited. And I think that the citation statistics show that material that is readily available, open access and online, is found and cited more frequently than stuff that sits behind subscription paywalls. And therefore, again, it takes a while for a journal to get established, but building up those impact factors should be possible in the sort of medium to longer term. Okay, so then we had a question about costs and how to pay for our journal. Now, Stephen mentioned that there are a number of ways in which open access journals can be funded. We were absolutely adamant that we did not want to charge APCs, author processing charges, because that would defeat the major purpose of setting up the journal in the first place, which was to make it more accessible to international readers and contributors. There was very little prospect that a journal that appealing to feminist legal scholars would be able to make a great deal of money out of advertising. And so we had to find some other means of paying for the journal. Now, all right, so then what are the costs going to be? Well, there are also ways of reducing the cost. So obviously, print journal, much, as I said, much more expensive than something that's online. In terms of what you do online, there is such a thing as open source journal software. So it's possible to make use of open source journal software, which means that you have no software licensing costs. The other thing from our experience with Springer was that we were very used to doing all the academic labour ourselves without getting paid. And so we thought, well, it's not going to change. We might as well continue doing that and at least have the satisfaction of doing it for ourselves and knowing that no multinational publisher is actually making a profit from our unpaid labour. So in fact, the only direct costs of the journal were the setup costs, so working out the visual design and tailoring the software to our needs, for which we were going to need IT support, and then the ongoing costs of server space to actually host the journal. And so we pitched the idea to the university that the university should pay for these minimal setup and server space costs through another colleague who happily and conveniently happened to be on the Information Services Committee, and the committee happily agreed to run the journal on a 12-month pilot basis to evaluate the software, the journal software, and decide whether this was something that the university should adopt as a centrally funded service. And so what we then did was that we met with the web development team to discuss our needs. They identified potential open source software. We tested a couple of options and settled on, I think, probably one of the most used systems, which is the Open Journal System, OJS. And the reason that we settled on that is that it's not only does it provide a good sort of visual, or has the capacity to provide sort of easily accessible material, but it has a very good back end. So all of the editorial functions, material can be submitted into the software, you can do all the editorial stuff through the software, you can organise the refereeing through the software, and then posting material very easily. And it's also very flexible, so it enables you to do things online or offline depending on what's most convenient. So, so it's not just about a site for posting content, but also handling all of the sort of back office stuff and the communication with authors and readers. Now, in terms of the design of the journal, and I just have to, this is going to be slightly interesting if I get out of this and go to this. Right, so this is what the sort of standard open journal system template looks like. It's a bit boring, it does the work. We decided that we wanted ours to be customised and to look a whole lot better than that. And so we looked at existing journals, identified designs and features that we liked. The web team did some designs for us, we settled on one and they implemented it. And so this is what our journal looks like. So you can see we've got a nice banner, thing down the side, which we update regularly with happenings going on, visuals, and then further down, announcements, things that people can click through to multimedia things directly. So it's, well, I think it's quite an attractive design. And then we solicited articles for our first issue. Let me just go back to the PowerPoint. Actually, I can't even decide which bits that I'm supposed to be looking at here. And we, So for our first issue, we ended up with, we sort of commissioned pieces that would talk about, the relevance of open access to the kinds of scholarships that we were interested in, submissions from a wide variety of international authors about current and future agendas for feminist legal studies across the world. So we got tried to get people who were quite high profile and to get a wide geographical coverage to kick the journal off. And happily, at the end of our 12-month pilot period, the university agreed to maintain support and to keep it running, and also to encourage the establishment of further open access journals at Kent. Now, in terms of the way that Feminists at Law has operated, one of the features about it at the moment is that it doesn't live at Kent. It's actually hosted by Simon Fraser University in Canada, which set up the Public Knowledge Project, which is where the open access software comes from. That is 10, isn't it, rather than... it costs a whole £550 per year to host per journal, and that cost is met by the university. I think the university's calculated that if the number of journals it runs exceeds 5, then it's more cost effective to bring it in-house, but for the time being, because there's only one, it's continued to be hosted at Simon Fraser, which also provide extremely good support from their help desk. So any time that we have had glitches, which has been very rare, you simply send them an email and they're back to you within less than 24 hours. As I've said, the software has proved to be very effective and efficient for processing and publishing, very user-friendly. I'm not particularly techie, but I have picked it up reasonably easily, and the same with other members of the editorial team. It's possible to publish text in a variety of formats, so you can see here we've got everything in Word, PDF and HTML, which is simply to maximise accessibility for anyone anywhere in the world who may or may not have access to the different formats. And then we also made some really exciting discoveries, the kind of freedom that you have when you're online. So first of all, there are no space restrictions. When you've got a print journal, you've usually got a page budget. When you've got an online journal, you can put as much material as you like. You can have a whole lot in one issue. You can have not very much in the next issue. It doesn't matter. You've got that complete freedom to add as you go along. Issues. You don't have to have all of your material together at one moment to send off to the publisher at that particular moment. You can build the issue as you go along. So what we tend to do is to start, so at the moment we're running one volume with 2 issues per year, and we say, right, issue 1 starts in September, issue 2 starts in March, and we build it as we go along. So you can see that the current issue only has one piece in it and plus some book reviews, but there are more things coming and we will simply add them as they go along. It also means for an author, as soon as your piece has been refereed, accepted, copy edited, it's posted, it's published. You don't have to wait until the next issue comes out. We also realised that we can have non-text material. We're not limited to text, so we can have audio files. This piece here is actually an audio lecture which has PowerPoints attached to it. So we asked her to give us a lecture on this particular topic, and she sent us an audio lecture with PowerPoints, so you can listen to the audio, look at the PowerPoints. We've had video materials, so there's sort of lots of different things. You can put pictures in your things. You can use ordinary visual material as part of a text thing, or to supplement a text thing. And the other thing that we had to deal with was in terms of licensing, and the real advantage, there was a question about licensing before, the real advantage of the CC BY license is that reuse and sort of multiple publication with attribution is a really good way of making sure that material is as widely accessible as possible and is seen by as many as people as possible. So We can republish things that have been published elsewhere as long as we attribute where they came from. People can republish things that have been on our site as long as they attribute where they came from, and just multiplies the possibility for your work to be seen. We did have a debate over whether we should impose an NC restriction, so non-commercial use. But in the end, we decided that our authors were likely to gain more by getting their work out there than they were likely to lose by not being able to make a vast profit on royalties on a particular piece of material. Again, we're talking about humanities and social science work here rather than scientific, cures for malaria. In terms of the other thing that we can do here, you see it's got a thing called register. Now, it's not necessary to register on the site in order to read it. You can access everything there without being a registered user, but if you are, then you get automatic updates and various other things, and you have to be registered in order to submit material to the journal. We've got, we started in 2011, we've now got 240 registered readers of the journal on my latest look. But what's really interesting about that number, it's not that it's huge, but that it's from an extremely broad range of areas. So Argentina, Australia, Austria, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Croatia, Ethiopia, Finland, Ireland, India, Malaysia, Netherlands, New Zealand, Pakistan, South Africa, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, USA. They're just the people who have actually said where they come from. And we know very well that there was no way that feminist legal studies was reaching that group of people. And not only are they academics, but also lawyers, NGO workers, public sector workers, students. And we're also getting submissions from a much wider geographical spread than we would have had before. Right, 5 minutes in which to give the remaining half of the paper. No, that's not true. Now, so one of my points is that we were doing open access, of course, well before the Finch report came out. And so, let's move on to where we were. Imagine our surprise when we read the Finch report and found that journals set up on the model that we have used, online, low cost, institutionally supported, barely rated any kind of a mention. Simon talked about gold or green. Stephen talked about gold or green. We're in between or somewhere else. Now, the Finch Committee, I think it's fair to say, there was a good representation of commercial publishers on that committee who wanted to continue to make profits out of journal publishing. Their preference is for gold with APCs. The major alternative that's been designed by universities is not sponsoring their own journals, but setting up institutional repositories. So that's why green is seen as the main alternative. Our model doesn't even have an agreed name. Sometimes it's included within gold. I think Stephen included us within gold because articles are open access immediately on publication. But while many publications pay lip service to the fact that immediate open access doesn't have to involve payment of an APC, gold is generally taken to include payment of an APC, and so there's often a lot of ambiguity when people say gold. What they really mean is with APCs. Our model, I've seen it referred to as diamond open access. We've called it platinum open access. But really, it's the only true open access model because it's open to both readers and authors. And in fact, in our, back to the website, one of our volumes, we actually published an editorial called Why We Oppose Gold Open Access. And I'll just give you very quickly in the 2 minutes remaining to me some reasons for why we oppose gold open access. And just to give you an idea of the sort of scale of things that we're talking about, Stephen gave the example of a print subscription to a particular scientific journal being just over $3,000 US. Well, one APC, one author processing charge to the kind of journals that I regularly publish in, published by the major publishers, is just over $3,000 US. It's $3,000 US plus VAT. So you can get a whole journal or one article published. So I think the journal's good value, actually. So the problem of course, with APCs at any kind of level is it makes the journal inaccessible to overseas authors, particularly authors from the Global South, who don't have access to funding for APCs. It has disadvantages for some UK authors, people who don't have institutional affiliations, postgraduate students, early career researchers, people whose work isn't funded by Research Council funding. It has disadvantages for less well-endowed UK institutions, some of which have said, we have no money for APCs, you must use green. There is no possibility of publishing on that excellent journal because we simply can't give you the money. So, I mean, one of the things that Finch referred to is that less well-endowed UK institutions have less access to subscription journals because they have less money to pay for subscriptions. Well, it just reproduces that differential in a different form. Their authors have less access to certain journal publishing because their institution doesn't have the money to pay for it. And of course, where you have APCs which are funded by block grants from the research councils, you then need to have an internal policy for distributing APCs. That creates transaction costs for the institution and also potentially differential access for different groups, different types of scholarship. There's another level of gatekeeping that goes on in deciding what gets paid for and what doesn't. The journals, the learned society journals and the discipline supporting journals are going to find it very difficult to function in an APC environment because, in fact, in humanities and social sciences, the amount that you can get from, so if you publish 20 articles a year, either you've got to charge very high APCs or you'll get nothing like the amount of money that you are getting from subscription packages, and therefore the funding being used to support disciplines is going to disappear. The final objection is that, again, certainly in my discipline, most of the major publishers have turned their journals into hybrid journals, which means that they're still getting subscriptions paid by libraries and they're charging APCs, so they're effectively double dipping and we're paying publishers twice to have our research read. So, Simon put up a slide which talked about, I think it was you, the growth in open access journals. In fact, the model here, the diamond, platinum, whatever you want to call it, model is the fastest growing sector of open access publishing. And so what I want to finish with is to say, help us to help it to grow further. So those of you who are academics, go back to my last slide, which says, support us. Send your work to open access online journals that don't charge APCs, won't cost you anything, it'll be very visible, and join us. Think about setting up journals on this model. The university is supporting them and I urge you to do so. Thank you.